In a dusty archive deep in the belly of a crumbling monastery, a single chart was found, a map that should not exist. Its ink faded, but defiant traces a path from the shores of the Levant, across deserts, mountains, and steppes, ending not in Jerusalem, nor in Rome, but in the heart of Mongolia, and in the margin, a strange cross, not Latin, not Greek, a Templar cross, drawn by a hand that knew its meaning. How could the most secretive knights of medieval Europe have reached so far, and why would they risk everything to get there? You let the question settle in your mind, heavy as a stone in still water. The Templars were not merchants of silk, nor pilgrims chasing relics. They were soldiers, bankers, and visionaries. And this map suggests a chapter of their history that official records never dared to write. The parchment was catalogued without ceremony. Just another oddity in a collection of forgotten things. No glowing display case, no velvet rope. It was placed among monastic inventories, tax ledgers, and the sort of correspondence that only ever mattered to the people who wrote it. Yet, to a trained eye, its lines whispered of roads that have not been walked for centuries. The routes are drawn with the assurance of someone who had been there, not merely heard about them. Caravan paths curling through Persia, river crossings where the map-maker knew the fords by name, and in the east, well beyond the safe reach of any medieval Christian power. The end point is marked with a symbol for Karakorum, the Mongol capital. The temptation, of course, is to dismiss it as an overactive medieval imagination. Maps from that era are littered with fantasy sea monsters, misplaced mountains, whole continents that only existed in the margins of sailors' tales. But this one is different. There is no whimsy here, no monstrous fish to decorate the oceans, no gilded script to flatter a patron. It is workmanlike, precise, as if its creator valued accuracy over beauty. The hand that drew it was not sketching for kings. It was guiding someone who needed to arrive alive. For centuries, the story of the Templars has been told as a European drama born in the Holy Land, rich beyond measure, crushed by the greed of a French king. What we rarely hear is what came after, not the official disbandment, but the quiet scattering of men who had trained for war and lived for a cause that could not be buried in papal decrees. Some went to sea, some to Scotland, and perhaps some turned east, toward the one power still feared and respected across Christendom and Islam alike. The Mongol Empire, the Mongols at their height, were more than horsemen with bows. They were the architects of the largest continuous land empire in human history, and they knew the Silk Road like a vein under the skin. To ride with them meant safety from bandits' passage across hostile territories and a share in the great exchange of goods, ideas, and perhaps secrets. If the Templars could have allied themselves with the Khans, or even simply moved among their caravans, they might have found a way to survive, and perhaps to influence the fate of both East and West. And so the map becomes not just an artifact, but an accusation. It suggests travel planning intent. It asks you to imagine the white mantles of the temple riding alongside Mongol scouts under a banner of truce carrying messages or gold. Perhaps even strategies for war. It asks you to follow the faint ink across the paper and see not an impossibility, but a road once taken. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You start with the simplest truth. People do not cross half the known world by accident. The journey from the fortresses of the Templars in the Levant to the windswept plains of Mongolia is not a casual detour. It is an undertaking so vast, so improbable, that it demands an extraordinary reason. And that is the riddle at the heart of this investigation. Why would a Western Christian military order sworn to defend the Holy Land and safeguard pilgrims look toward the Mongol world? At all history offers its most obvious answer in the climate of desperation that gripped the Crusader states in the late 13th century. By then, the glittering successes of the First Crusade were a fading memory. The Christian foothold in the East had shrunk to fragile enclaves under constant siege, and every season brought new disasters. It was not unthinkable that a military order faced with annihilation might look for an ally wherever one could be found. Even among the so-called barbarian horsemen, whose armies had thundered into Europe itself only a generation before. But alliances are never made from necessity alone. They are built on opportunity, mutual benefit, and sometimes on dreams that outpace reality. And the Mongols at first glance presented a curious opportunity indeed. Too much of Europe, they were a nightmare made flesh. Chroniclers spoke of towns, reduced to smoking rubble of rivers choked with the dead. Yet merchants whispered of something else, a disciplined empire, one that policed its roads with ruthless efficiency, where a bolt of silk could travel from China to the Black Sea under the protection of imperial authority, an empire whose khans had already sent envoys to the Pope and whose generals had fought side by side with Christian knights in campaigns against Muslim powers. That mixture of terror and fascination was a potent one. Of course, there were voices that saw in the Mongols a divine instrument, not of wrath, but of salvation. Some in Christendom believed the khans might be converted, that the East could be turned into a bulwark against Islam, and that the road to Jerusalem might be opened again through the steppes. If the Templars entertained this vision, they would not have been alone. European courts received Mongol ambassadors with cautious optimism. The papacy itself commissioned diplomatic missions to the Mongol capitals. These were not idle gestures. They were explorations of possibility, trial balloons sent into the vast and alien skies of the East. Yet there is a detail here that unsettles the neatness of the story. Not every contact between the West and the Mongols was open or official. The surviving records, and they are frustratingly fragmentary, hint at journeys taken without royal sanction, letters delivered without oversight. A PayPal envoy might travel in the open, but a small party of hardened, well-funded warriors, they could move in shadows. The Templars had wealth, they had discipline, and they had reasons to conceal their movements. Especially after the order began to fall from grace in European politics. The map surfaces in your mind once more, its inked roots tugging faintly at the edge of your memory. It is one thing to speculate about political or religious motives, and another to see them suggested in a tangible artifact. The chart's lines do not meander as the roots of a fanciful armchair crafter might. They proceed with a quiet determination, as if drawn by someone mapping out an answer to the very question now before us. How do you reach the Mongol world from the crumbling bastions of Utrimmer? Modern historians, of course, debate whether the Templars ever seriously considered such a journey. Some argue that the order was too deeply embedded in the politics of Europe to risk alignment with a power that could just as easily turn its armies westward. Others counter that the Templars had always been pragmatic, and that their very survival depended on the kind of strategic boldness such a mission would represent. That divide among scholars is telling, not only because it reveals how little is certain, but because it mirrors the same mixture of hope and fear that medieval leaders must have felt when the name of the great Khan was spoken in their halls. It is tempting to imagine the decision being made in some candlelit chamber of a Templar commandery. A handful of knights around a rough-hewn table, maps and letters spread before them, weighing the risk of annihilation against the promise of a powerful ally. Outside the world changes, Muslim armies draw closer. European kings grow wary of their independence, and the roads west may be closing forever. In such a moment, the East might seem less like a distant and hostile frontier, and more like a door still slightly ajar. So the Eastern question is not a simple one. It is not just why they would go, but what they hoped to find once they arrived. Was it a last gamble to preserve the Order's mission, a covert effort to weave themselves into the Mongol trade networks and sustain their wealth, or was it something far more ambitious, a vision of uniting East and West in a cause that could reshape the medieval world? For now, the answers remain elusive, but the question, why go east at all, is the compass that will guide everything that follows. And like all good compasses, it does not tell you what you will find at the end of the road, only which way to begin walking. You picture the night of October 13th, 1307. Not as a blaze of violence, but as a sudden, suffocating silence. Across France, doors were kicked in before dawn, men in white mantles dragged from their beds, and entire commanderies sealed shut. The arrests of the Templars were as swift as they were shocking, and they marked the moment when one of the most powerful military orders in Christendom became a hunted brotherhood overnight. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, would be imprisoned, interrogated, and eventually executed. But for many rank-and-file Templars, the story did not end in a Parisian dungeon. It dissolved into 100 smaller stranger paths, some documented, most lost to time. Historically, we know that the charges against them were driven less by theology than by politics and greed. King Philip IV of France owed the order enormous debts, and their independence had long irritated both crown and clergy. By pressing Pope Clement V into sanctioning their suppression, Philip could erase what he owed, seize their treasure, and remove a rival power from his realm. The papal decree to disband the order would follow, spreading the purge across much of Europe. In theory, Templar property was to be transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. In practice, much of it simply vanished. This is where the mystery deepens. In countries like Portugal and Scotland, the Templars were never truly destroyed. They resurfaced under new names, merged into other orders, or simply continued their activities with local protection. Some slipped away entirely, their movements unrecorded, their allegiances unclear. It is in those unaccounted for men and resources that theories of Eastern escape take root. The conventional narrative tells us that many former Templars settled quietly into civilian life or took service under sympathetic rulers. Yet, there are intriguing, if incomplete, hints of more daring trajectories. In the records of the Crown of Aragon, there are notes of Templar ships disappearing from ports in the weeks after the arrests began. In England, there are court testimonies describing brethren who were seen no more after their initial questioning. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, merchants and pilgrims alike reported rumors of armed contingents moving inland under strange banners slipping away toward regions where papal authority held little sway. This idea that some survivors deliberately sought out lands beyond the reach of both the French king and the Pope is not without controversy. Skeptics argue that the logistics alone make such flights improbable. Moving heavily armed men across hostile territories without attracting attention would have required either extraordinary stealth or the protection of a powerful host. Proponents counter that the Templars were exactly the kind of organization capable of such feats. They had experience moving treasure and personnel under threat, and they maintained a network of allies and informants across Christendom and into the Levant. Here the connection to the East begins to take shape. By 1307, the Mongol Empire was no longer the unified juggernaut it had once been, but its western connatates still controlled vast territories from the Black Sea to Central Asia. Crucially, they were not bound by the papal orders that had condemned the Templars. If anything, their intermittent hostility toward Muslim powers might have made them natural allies for a Christian military order with no home. 4. A Templar fugitive aligning with Mongol forces or even merely traveling under their protection could have offered safety resources and a path to rebuild. The problem, of course, is evidence. There are no surviving letters from Jacques de Molay instructing his brethren to flee eastward, no official chronicles describing a Templar caravan rolling into Samarkand. What exists instead are fragments, a Persian account of foreign knights in the service of a local ruler, a Genoese trading record that notes unusual payments for escorts, traveling deep into Asia. The occasional reference in later chronicles to Christian warriors of unknown origin appearing far from Europe. None of these prove the case, but together they keep the possibility alive. And then there's the peculiar case of the map you encountered earlier, the one that suggests a path from the Levant to the Mongol. If it is indeed of Templar origin, it fits more comfortably into this post-307 landscape than into the height of their crusading years. After the fall, the Order had no strongholds left to defend, no official battles to fight in the Holy Land. Their needs would have been different escape routes, safe harbors, alliances with powers that could shield them from extradition. A detailed chart of the overland roads through Persia and into Mongolia would have been exactly the kind of lifeline such fugitives might require. Modern historians remain divided on how far these remnants of the Order could have gone. Some suggest the eastern escape was more a scattering of individuals than an organized migration, with a few knights perhaps joining mercenary companies or attaching themselves to merchant caravans. Others imagine a more deliberate strategy, a conscious pivot to the east as a new theater of influence. Both views leave plenty of room for conjecture and plenty of space for the Templars to slip between the lines of official history. What is undeniable is that after 1307, the Templars ceased to exist as a centralized European power, but they did not simply vanish. In some places they were absorbed, in others they were tolerated, and somewhere perhaps they became something else, entirely a remnant of white-clad riders, moving far from the cathedrals and courts that had once sheltered them, heading toward a horizon where papal bulls could not follow. That horizon, as the next part of our journey will show, might just have been the Mongol world. The idea of Templar knights riding east toward Mongol lands begins to feel less like fantasy once you remember that contact between Christendom and the Khans was not only possible, but had already been attempted in the middle decades of the 13th century, long before the Order's downfall. Europe and the Mongols had shared a mutual enemy, the Islamic powers of the Middle East. This overlap in interests opened a narrow but real space for diplomacy, and into that space stepped envoys, emissaries, and perhaps the occasional soldier of the temple. The first serious overtures came after the Mongols' terrifying incursions into Eastern Europe in the 1240s. Cities like Kiev and Budapest had been sacked, and the thunder of hooves had reached as far west as the Adriatic. European leaders initially saw the Mongols as a scourge from God sent to punish the faithful. But as the Mongols withdrew and consolidated their conquests, a more nuanced picture emerged. Reports filtered back of a vast empire that, for all its brutality, allowed religious freedom, valued skilled artisans, regardless of creed, and most enticingly, 4 Crusader strategists had waged war against the Muslim heartlands with startling success. It was not long before both the papacy and the Crusader states began to wonder whether these same armies could be turned toward a common goal, the reconquest of Jerusalem. Envoys were dispatched. In 1245, Pope Innocent IV sent the Franciscan friar Giovanni Dean del Carpini to the Mongol court, carrying letters that alternated between polite inquiry and veiled threat. A decade later, the famous William of Rub made his own journey east, this time with more curiosity than menace, describing in detail the customs and politics of the Mongol elite. These missions were not merely academic exercises. They were probes feeling out the possibility of military alliance, and there were moments when that possibility seemed almost within reach. In 1260, the Mongols captured Damascus, driving out the forces of the Mamluk Sultanate. Crusader garrisons in the region, including those with Templar contingents, held their breath as they weighed whether to join in the advance. Instead, the Mongols withdrew before pushing further south, leaving the Mamluks to reclaim their losses. But the idea of cooperation did not die there. In 1262, the Mongol ruler Hulagu Khan sent a letter to King Louis IX of France proposing joint operations against Muslim forces. Although no decisive campaign emerged from this exchange, it left behind a trail of correspondence showing that the channels between East and West were open. This is where the Templars might have played a subtle but significant role, as one of the best organized military orders in the Levant. They had the infrastructure to host and protect envoys, to exchange intelligence, and to maintain contacts that did not always pass through royal channels. Some chroniclers even suggest that Templar representatives attended councils where Mongol proposals were debated, though the records are too fragmentary to name individuals. If such contacts existed, they would have provided the order with a rare and valuable familiarity with Mongol politics, geography, and roots knowledge that might be repurposed decades later under very different circumstances. Not all reactions to these proposed alliances were enthusiastic. Many in Christendom distrusted the Mongols too deeply to imagine them as partners. Stories of massacres, atrocities, and the destruction of Christian communities in Eastern Europe were still fresh in collective memory. For every voice urging cooperation, there was another warning that the Khans could turn their armies west again at the slightest provocation. This tension between the lure of a decisive ally and the fear of a future conqueror kept negotiations tentative, never allowing them to solidify into the grand coalition that some strategists dreamed of. Yet, from a Templar perspective, even tentative contact had value. They could observe the Mongols' military organization, their reliance on speed and discipline, and the extraordinary reach of their courier networks. They could learn how the Khans maintained control over such vast distances and how they integrated conquered peoples into their system without erasing local customs. These were lessons in survival as much as in conquest. And for a military order that would one day be outlawed and scattered, survival would become the more urgent skill. The most tantalizing question is whether any of these early diplomatic threads were picked up again after the order's fall in 1307. If former Templars were searching for refuge or allies, they would have known that the Mongols had already been approached by Christian powers, that treaties had been discussed, and that at least some channels of communication were still remembered in the courts of both sides. An outlawed knight stripped of land but not of ambition might look at that history and see not a dead end but a door left slightly ajar. This is where the story returns to the map and the faint suggestion of overland routes drawn with an almost obsessive precision. Could it be that these lines traced not just a hypothetical journey, but a revival of earlier diplomatic paths routes, once walked by friars and envoys, now to be ridden by knights whose order no longer had a home? Modern historians continue to debate it, some arguing that the idea of post-dissolution Templars reactivating these contacts is more romance than reality. Others point out that stranger alliances have been forged in times of desperation, and that the Templars had a long history of pragmatism when survival was at stake. Whatever the truth, the possibility hangs there like a thread caught in a tapestry, visible only if you lean close, and tempting you to tug at it to see what might unravel. And when you do, you find that the thread leads onward, not to speculation alone, but to fragments of correspondence that might just bear the weight of the story. Those letters, some written in Latin, some in Persian, and some in a curious blend of both, may be the closest we come to hearing the Templars' voices on the road to Mongolia. If a road exists in history, it is often paved not in stone, but in ink. The fragile looping script of medieval correspondence has carried armies to war-stitched alliances across continents and occasionally betrayed secrets to the wrong set of eyes. In the case of the Templars and the Mongols, what survives of this paper trail is sparse, weathered, and maddeningly incomplete, but it is enough to suggest that messages did travel between the Latin West and the steppes, sometimes through official channels, sometimes through hands far less accountable. The most famous of these letters are the diplomatic exchanges between Mongol rulers and European monarchs in the mid-13th century. Hulagu Khan's missive to King Louis, the first Nine of France, is well known, a formal confident offer to coordinate military action against the Mamluks, couched in the grand style of Mongol Diplomacy with just enough arrogance to remind the recipient that this was an empire accustomed to being obeyed. Lewis's reply, in turn, was polite, but careful, agreeing in principle to a shared cause, while sidestepping any implication that the French crown was subordinate to the Khan. These letters are preserved in archives copied by scribes who may not have fully understood the geography or politics they described. But beyond the neat Latin and the gold-inked Mongolian seals, there are odder fragments. In the Vatican archives lies a single sheet written partly in Latin and partly in what scholars identify as Persian-inflected Mongolian, its handwriting suggesting a scribe trained in 11 chancery. It bears no date and no signature, only a reference to brothers of the temple acting as trusted intermediaries in the delivery of gifts to an Eastern ruler. The gifts are not specified, though the word chosen in the original could equally mean relics, horses, or weapons. It is an open question whether this was an official embassy or a private arrangement conducted under the radar of both crown and pope. Even more curious is a Genoese merchant record from Trebizond, noting a payment to foreign knights for escorting a convoy carrying letters toward the cities of the Tatars. The date is just late enough, around 1310, to place it after the Templar arrests in France. The record does not call these men Templars outright, but the description of their equipment and discipline reads as though lifted from a Frankish chronicler's portrayal of the order. Were these simply mercenaries who had acquired old Templar gear, or was this a glimpse of former brothers reinventing themselves under another guise? For historians, the challenge lies in separating hopeful interpretation from documented fact. Skeptics argue that the presence of Western warriors in Mongolian routes proves nothing. Mercenaries from Europe did make their way east, and any of them could have taken part in such journeys. Supporters of the Eastern Templar theory counter that the skills needed to navigate both Latin and Mongol diplomatic customs, as well as the financial means to travel such distances, narrow the field considerably. Who but a military order with deep pockets and an established intelligence network could have managed it? The letters themselves tell us as much through what they omit as through what they state. In several surviving Mongol communications to European rulers, there is an assumption of familiarity, a reference to your envoys who came before, a casual mention of our mutual understanding. Such phrases imply prior undocumented exchanges, perhaps even involving figures who were never recorded in official annals. The possibility that some of those figures might have worn the Red Cross of the temple cannot be dismissed outright, especially given the Order's history of taking on sensitive missions that required both secrecy and trust. And yet the trail is tantalizingly broken. For every preserved parchment, there are a dozen we know must have existed, but were lost to warfire or the sheer fragility of vellum and ink over centuries. The Mongols themselves maintained vast archives, but the collapse of their western Keats scattered those records, leaving only fragments in Persian, Armenian, and Chinese collections. Occasionally, one surfaces a brittle sheet from a forgotten library, a folded note hidden in the binding of a later book, and with it comes another glimpse of this shadow diplomacy. The map returns unbidden to your mind, its lines charting an unbroken path to the Mongol capital. A map without letters is a skeleton, without flesh. The correspondence, however incomplete, begins to clothe that journey in motive and intent. These letters, formal, cryptic, or commercial, are not random noise. They suggest a patterned communication across a distance that most Europeans of the age could barely imagine, involving people who were comfortable operating in that space. Modern scholars continue to debate whether any of this correspondence involved actual Templars after the Order's suppression, or whether later imaginations have retrofitted the legend to fit the facts. The arguments grow sharp at academic conferences, where one side waves the Genoese merchant record as a smoking gun, while the other dismisses it as coincidence. But the very fact that the debate endures tells you something. There is just enough here just enough in these scattered scraps of parchment to keep the possibility alive. And if words could cross those thousands of miles carried on horseback from one empire to another, then men could too. Men who knew how to keep a secret. Men who had lost their homes but not their skills. Men who perhaps looked east not as an escape but as a beginning. If the letters hinted at movement, the trade routes explain how it could have happened. The Silk Road was not a single road at all, but a web of arteries pulsing with caravans and merchants, where languages mingled like the scent of spices in a crowded bazaar. To travel, it was to step into a moving city without walls, and if you were clever, you could vanish into its currents as easily as a drop of ink into dark water. That is what makes the theory of Templar survival through trade so seductive, because it offers a plausible disguise for men trained for war. Historically, the Templars were no strangers to commerce. Their legend may be draped in the romance of the Crusades, but behind the walls of their commanderies, they ran something far more practical, a banking system that stretched from London to Jerusalem. They safeguarded treasure, transferred funds across borders, and extended credit to kings. Their ships moved not just troops, but goods. Grain, wine, and olive oil flowed through their ports, alongside more exotic import silks from the East, spices from India, and occasionally curiosities from lands further still. For an order that controlled ports in Cyprus and had ties to merchant republics like Venice and Genoa, the Silk Road was less a distant mystery and more an extension of their existing network. The theory takes shape here. If you are a Templar in the wake of 1307, stripped of official sanction and hunted by the authorities, you do not march openly under a cross. You fold yourself into something else. A merchant caravan is perfect. It moves at a steady pace, guarded by hired men, with enough legitimate trade to hide anything you might also be carrying. A chest of gold, a collection of letters, even yourself. Under the protection of a merchant seal, you could pass through cities where an armed band of outlaws would be turned away or arrested. An obscure but fascinating detail from the records of the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia adds fuel to this. In the early 14th century, local officials granted trading privileges to Latin caravans in exchange for military assistance against regional rivals. The wording is strange. Why not simply Latin merchants? The implication that these traders could also fight suggests a hybrid role, part commercial envoy, part warrior escort. It is tempting to see in this a reflection of the Templar model, even if the original documents never named them directly. Here the scholarly divide emerges again. Critics argue that merchant disguise was impractical for knights trained in warfare. The skills of diplomacy, language, and navigation required for long-distance trade were not easily acquired. Supporters countered that the Templars already employed such people. Not every brother wielded a sword, and their network included lay affiliates skilled in administration and commerce. It would not have been difficult for such men to repurpose their knowledge to keep the order alive in another form. There is also the matter of protection. The Silk Road was dangerous, and armed guards were a necessity for caravans carrying high-value goods. In the western reaches of the route through Anatolia, the Caucasus, and Persia, Christian merchants often preferred Christian escorts when they could get them. A small group of disciplined fighters could find steady employment in such work, and employment meant both mobility and money. Money in turn bought the cooperation of local officials, bribes at hostile checkpoints, and the favor of influential hosts. A memory stirs the Khans steadfast in their demand for order along every stretch of their trade routes. Merchants who paid their dues could expect the empire's protection enforced by a system of relay stations and patrols. For a disguised Templar moving with such a caravan would mean that Mongol forces themselves might shield you from attack of bitter irony, considering the fear they once inspired in the West. In such a scenario, the warrior's skills and the merchant's cover would be perfectly aligned. The open question is whether any of this movement was organized or simply opportunistic. Was there a conscious plan among surviving Templars to use trade as a cover for eastward travel? Or were these isolated acts by individuals seeking safety or fortune? No surviving order-wide directive suggests a coordinated effort, but the disappearance of so many Templar records, the vanishing archives we will examine later, leaves the possibility untested. The tantalizing thought is that the same discipline that once moved troops across continents could in desperate times move them along the Silk Road without leaving a trace. And here once more the map seems to hum with a deeper meaning. The routes it records are the lifeblood of merchants, not armies. The waypoints marked are caravans arrays and market towns rather than castles or battlegrounds. If a Templar hand drew, it may have been less a battle plan and more a trade itinerary. The skeleton of a journey hidden beneath the pretense of commerce. In the end, the merchant disguise is both plausible and maddeningly difficult to prove. Archaeologists find coins from Venice and Genoa in Central Asian hoards, but coins alone do not tell us who carried them. The merchant records from Trebizond or Trez might hint at armed escorts, but the names are absent or deliberately obscured. What remains is the image of a white mantle rolled tightly in a merchant's pack, its cross hidden from view, while its owner rides beside bales of silk and sacks of pepper toward a horizon marked in ink on an aging piece of parchment. If the Templars truly moved eastward, whether as merchants, envoys, or warriors in disguise, they would have needed more than maps and courage. They would have needed places to stop, safe houses where they could rest, resupply, and exchange information without drawing the attention of hostile powers. In the west, these were the preceptors' fortified compounds that served as administrative hubs, training centers, and logistical anchors for the Order's far-flung operations. If anything like them existed beyond the Levant, they could form the skeleton of a hidden network leading toward Mongolia. Templar preceptories were not castles in the romantic sense, though some were certainly built to withstand attack. They were functional complexes, often located near trade routes or ports, where brothers could manage estates, store goods, and coordinate their duties. In Europe and the Holy Land, they were marked by the same architectural fingerprints: thick plain walls, a chapel often aligned with Jerusalem's storage cellars, and stables large enough to house a sudden influx of horses. To find these hallmarks in the East would be to find a whisper of the Order's passage. Yet here, the hunt becomes murky. Official records give no hint of prectories beyond the recognized boundaries of Templar activity, but archaeology occasionally teases with suggestions. In parts of Armenia and eastern Anatolia, there are fortified compounds from the late 13th and early 14th centuries, whose design does not neatly match local traditions. They are too plain to be princely residences, too well built to be mere caravans arise. One site near Lake Va, excavated in the mid-20th century, yielded a fragment of carved stone bearing a faint weathered crosspate. The find is disputed. Some say it's a Crusader relic brought later by pilgrims. Others argue it may be in situ, a remnant of a structure that served knights on their way east. A more obscure case lies in the ruins outside Trey, once a major hub of Silk Road trade under the Mongol Ilkhanate. Local chronicles mention a fort of the foreigners, where Christian travelers were welcomed and lodged without charge. The description, a walled enclosure with a chapel, a well, and a granary, fits the Templar template almost too well. Though no definitive evidence ties it to the Order, the building itself has long since been reduced to rubble by earthquakes, its stones repurposed into later constructions, leaving only the story in the pages of a Persian historian who seemed faintly amused by the customs of his foreign guests. Skeptics point out that many military and religious groups built similar facilities along the Silk Road, and that architectural parallels alone cannot prove a Templar presence. Yet the Templars' reputation for efficiency, and their emphasis on standardized layouts give weight to the possibility. If they did establish even a handful of such Eastern preceptories, it would suggest not random wandering, but deliberate planning, a chain of waypoints stretching toward the Mongol sphere, each one capable of sheltering and resupplying a small contingent. You can imagine how such places would have operated. A rider arriving after weeks on the road would find a secure gate, a place to stable his horse, a simple but hot meal, and perhaps most importantly, familiar faces. There would be news from further east, passed quietly over the table, letters written in cipher for onward couriers, goods swapped between caravans to keep appearances intact. Even if the men there were no longer officially Templars, their mantles, perhaps hidden or discarded, the discipline and trust built over years of shared service would remain. One intriguing thread connects back to the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, which, as we have already seen, was a vital staging ground for both merchants and warriors. Some Armenian records mention land grants to Latin brothers who maintained garrisons in exchange for defending border roads. The exact identity of these brothers is not always given, but in the late 13th century, the term was often shorthand for Templars. If even a few of these outposts survived the political upheavals of the early 14th century, they could have formed the western anchor of an eastward network. The debate over Eastern preceptories remains one of the more heated subtopics in the Eastern Templar hypothesis. Those who reject the idea argue that the distances involve the scarcity of Christian populations in certain regions, and the logistical challenges make such a network unlikely. Those who support it counter that the Mongol Empire's relative religious tolerance and its appetite for skilled fighters could have provided the cover needed for such installations to exist. The open question, and it is a sharp one, is whether we are looking at a handful of isolated refugees used by fugitive knights, or whether there was truly an organized infrastructure capable of sustaining a sustained Templar movement deep into Asia, without definitive archaeological proof. The matter rests on inference pattern recognition and the occasional artifact that seems too out of place to ignore. And so, when the image of that stubborn map returns, it's easy to see its points of rest as more than nameless towns. They might be the ghosts of preceptories, now lost, where white-mantled riders once crossed the threshold under cover of night. Their journey eastward, broken into stages as deliberate as any campaign they had ever fought. If the Templars were moving east, Persia would have been their unavoidable hinge point. The vast, varied landscape that both connected and divided the Mediterranean world from the Central Asian steppes. For centuries before the Mongols, Persia had been a crossroads where caravans from China and India met traders from Byzantium and Arabia. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, under the Mongol Ilkhanate, it had become something else as well, a political laboratory where Islam, Christianity, and Buddhism coexisted uneasily under the patronage of Khans, who prized order along their trade routes above all else. For any traveler, especially one with reasons to avoid PayPal or royal notice, Persia was both a challenge and an opportunity. The Persian heartland offered multiple points of entry from the west. From the Levant, one could travel through the Armenian highlands and descend toward Tray, a city that had become a glittering capital of Mongol administration and commerce. From the Black Sea, ships could ferry men and goods to ports in the Caucasus, where overland roads threaded through mountain passes into the fertile plains, and from the south, Persian Gulf ports welcomed merchant vessels from Hormuz and beyond, their holds crammed with goods and, occasionally with passengers who preferred to keep their names off official manifests. Here the Templars as pre-existing networks would have mattered, before their suppression. They had handled not only the movement of troops, but also the secure transport of valuables, relics, gold, letters of credit, through some of the same territories. In friendly lands, they could rely on their own commanderies. In hostile or uncertain regions, they used intermediaries, trusted merchants, allied orders, or local Christian communities. The Notorians, whose presence stretched deep into Persia, often served as translators and fixers for Western travelers, and it is tempting to imagine them aiding disguised Templars in slipping through the latticework of Mongol governance. An obscure detail from the Alkand Chronicles fuels this speculation. One account written by Rashid Allen describes the Khan Ghazan receiving a group of Frankish writers who brought gifts and letters from their brethren to the west. The writers are not identified as envoys of any king or pope, which is unusual for formal embassies. Some historians suggest they may have been agents of a mercantile consortium. Others wonder if they were a military order, acting unofficially. Given the Templars' reputation for handling delicate negotiations, the possibility that they were among these unnamed writers is not easily dismissed. Persia, under Mongol rule, was in some ways safer for foreign travelers than it had been for centuries. The Pax Mongolica, the enforced peace of the empire, meant that a caravan could, in theory, travel from the Mediterranean to the borders of China without fear of banditry, so long as it carried the proper passes. Those passes, known as PA, were issued to merchants and envoys the Mongols favored. Holding one meant you could demand food and shelter along the route, compel the use of relay horses, and expect a degree of legal immunity. If the Templars could acquire paisa, whether through legitimate diplomacy or more subtle means, their movement east would have been dramatically easier. The difficulty lay in crossing the cultural thresholds embedded within Persian society. Cities, like Tab or Sultania, welcomed foreigners, but rural areas could be less forgiving. Navigating these landscapes required fluency, not only in language but in custom. Here again, the order's pre-suppression experience served them well. Templar brothers stationed in the Levant had lived for years amid a blend of Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Armenian influences. Many spoke multiple tongues, understood trade etiquette, and could pass themselves off as something other than soldiers if they chose. And yet, there is an unresolved question. Did Persia serve the Templars merely as a transit zone, or did it also become a place of settlement? A handful of Armenian and Persian documents hint at Latin Christians entering Mongol service as military advisors, engineers, or caravan guards, some staying for years. Whether these were individual fugitives or part of a coordinated presence is unknown. The archaeological record is no more decisive. A few Western-style gravestones in Persian cemeteries, a scattering of coins bearing European designs found in caravanserai hordes. Such finds speak of contact, but not of the organizational backbone we would expect from a true Templar outpost. It is in this ambiguity that the Persian strand of the Eastern Templar story lies. Persia could have been a brief stop, a place to rest and gather supplies before pressing on to Mongolia, or it could have been the point where the journey's purpose shifted, where some knights, finding safety and opportunity, chose to remain under Mongol protection rather than gamble on the harsher unknowns of the steppe. Whichever was true, Persia was the unavoidable bridge, the great filter through which every eastbound traveler had to pass. And if you imagine the inked lines of that mysterious map, again, Persia sits squarely at its center, a knot of roads and rivers binding together to worlds. Any Templar hand that traced that route would have lingered over it, knowing that to cross this land successfully was to hold the key to the whole journey. If Persia was the physical bridge between the Mediterranean and the steppes, then the Christians were the human bridge, a network of faith, family, and culture that stretched across thousands of miles. To a fugitive Templar or a covert envoy, they could be the difference between anonymity and annihilation. These were the Christians who had adapted themselves to the East so completely that they were woven into the fabric of Mongol society, serving as translators, physicians, scribes, merchants, and sometimes as advisors to the Khans themselves. The Church of the East, often called Nistaran by its rivals, had existed for centuries before the Mongols rose to power. born out of theological disputes in the early Christian world. It had established itself in Persia, then fanned out along the trade routes into Central Asia, India, and even China. By the 13th century, its bishops presided overseas, as far apart as Baghdad, Samarkand, and Kabalik, the great city the West would call Beijing. These communities were bound not only by their shared faith, but also by their fluency in the languages and customs of the regions they inhabited. They could speak Syriac in their liturgies, Persian in the markets, and Mongolian in the K's audience hall. For the Templars, whose survival after 1307 may have depended on moving unseen through foreign lands, this was an ideal ally. A white mantle might draw suspicion in a Muslim port or a Buddhist town, but under the protection of a Narration host, a former Templar could blend in as a fellow Christian pilgrim, a guard for a caravan, or even a humble clerk. In Thucydides of the Ilkhanate Praetorian churches stood in neighborhoods where foreign traders lodged, and their leaders often had the ear of local governors. It is not hard to imagine such a church doubling as a discreet meeting place where letters could be passed and travel arrangements quietly secured. There is a suggestive passage in the writings of the Franciscan missionary John of Monte Cervino, who traveled through Persia and into China in the late 13th century. He notes with both admiration and exasperation that the Nestorians receive the Latins with honor, yet conduct their affairs without revealing all they know. His words hint at a community adept at managing multiple loyalties loyal to their own hierarchy, cooperative with Western Christians when it suited them, but always careful to preserve their standing with local rulers. That skill in balancing interests would have been exactly what a Templar on the run required from a host. An obscure Armenian chronicle adds another tantalizing layer. It tells of men from the West who served under a Mongol general in Persia, their movements coordinated by a bishop of the Eastern Rite. The chronicler's choice of words strongly suggests a Notorian prelate acting as intermediary. Whether these men from the West were mercenaries, traitors, or something more elusive remains an open question. But the overlap of military skill and ecclesiastical shelter is difficult to ignore. Skeptics of the Eastern Templar theory often point out that the notorious relationship with Latin Christianity was complicated. The two churches were doctrinally estranged, and there were moments of outright rivalry for influence at Mongol courts. Why, they ask, would the Notorians risk sheltering an outlawed Western order? The counter-argument is pragmatic. The Mongols valued military expertise, and any guest under Narration protection who could offer it would increase the host's prestige. For a bishop or a wealthy Notorian merchant, taking in such guests could be less about theology and more about strengthening their own position in the Kach's eyes. There is also the matter of shared vulnerability. Under some Mongol rulers, Nestorians flourished. Under others, they were sidelined in favor of Muslim or Buddhist factions. In such shifting sands, alliances were fluid, and hosting Western warriors might be a calculated insurance policy against a future where Latin influence could rise again. The Templars, for their part, would have found in the Notorians a rare form of shelter, one that offered both cultural camouflage and practical connections deeper into Asia. Looking again at the routes sketched on that mysterious map, you can imagine how these human waypoints might have functioned from the Armenian highlands into Tray, from there into the caravan towns of Karuz, and further still towards Samaran. Each stop could be anchored by a Notorian community. Each community, a small island where a familiar liturgy and a sympathetic host waited behind unremarkable walls. In a world where the wrong accent or a misplaced word could mark you as an outsider, that familiarity could mean survival. The question that lingers, one scholars still debate, is whether this connection was part of an organized Templar plan or simply a coincidence, born of necessity. Were the Notorians consciously integrated into a hidden eastward network, or did individual fugitives simply find their way to them, guided by rumor and luck? The surviving records do not settle the matter. but they do show that the Nestoran presence was there, constant and rocking, like a quiet thread running through the fabric of the Silk Road. And for those who might have been following the map's inked path toward Mongolia, that thread could have been the lifeline that kept them moving eastward. By the time Marco Polo returned to Venice in 1295, his tales of the East had already begun to ferment into legend. He spoke of cities that dwarfed anything in Europe, of markets overflowing with silk and spices of the great Khan's court, where gold and porcelain glittered beneath banners of every hue. His account, as dictated to Rusticello d'Isa, is famously rich in detail, yet equally famous for its omissions. Nowhere does he mention the Knights Templar, but absence in a medieval prologue does not always mean absence on the road. It can just as easily mean discretion. The Polo family's journey eastward began decades before Marco's own departure, with his father, Niccolo, and Uncle Maffo making an earlier trip that brought them to the court of Kublai Khan. They had traveled as merchants carrying goods and letters, and returning with a request from the Khan for learned men of the West. That the Pope was willing to send friars eastward in response shows that the Venetian merchants were already seen as safe intermediaries, people who could navigate the political and physical hazards of the route, if there were others moving along those same roads under less obvious banners. The Polos would have been well placed to know. One of the stranger aspects of Marco's account is his attention to military matters. He notes the organization of Mongol armies, the placement of garrisons, and even the quality of certain regional horse breeds. Some of this could be natural curiosity, but it has led a handful of modern historians to speculate that he was either traveling with or borrowing intelligence from men with a more martial purpose. If that were the case, then a Templar connection, however faint, becomes conceivable. The order was known to employ secular agents, and likewise to travel under the cover of merchant ventures when moving valuable cargo or personnel. An obscure reference in a peasant merchant's diary dated roughly to Marco Polo's homeward journey adds a curious wrinkle. The writer notes that the Venetians came in company with Riders of the Cross, who bore no livery, but were known by their speech. The phrase Riders of the Cross is vague, but in a Mediterranean context, it could refer to any crusading order. Still, the combination of anonymity and recognizably Western origins fits uncomfortably well with what we might expect of fugitive Templars traveling incognito. Skeptics rightly point out that Polo's narrative, for all its fame, is riddled with puzzles that have nothing to do with the Templar cities. He omits events, he misdates, and embellishments that strain credibility. To graft the Templars into his story risks turning speculation into wishful thinking. Yet there is a tantalizing plausibility to the idea. The Polos had every reason to keep sensitive company discreet, particularly if those companions were traveling under questionable circumstances in territories where the wrong word could mean arrest, ransom, or execution. If such companions existed, they would have been useful to both parties. For the Templars, the Polos offered cover and credibility in Mongol lands. For the Polos, having battle-hardened men along the route could mean safer passage through regions where Mongol protection was weaker or absent. And if the Templars were indeed pursuing contact with the Khach's court, whether to secure refuge, negotiate alliance, or simply reconnoiter, then traveling alongside a Venetian merchant family already welcomed at that court would have been an elegant solution. The open question is whether any fragment of that mysterious map could be tied to the Polo's own itineraries. Some scholars have pointed to similarities between Polo's recorded route and the path shown on the chart, particularly in the careful placement of river crossings and caravanserai stops in Persia and Central Asia. The idea is that the map might have been compiled from multiple sources, part merchant record, part military reconnaissance, making it a kind of composite of journeys, both open and clandestine. In the absence of direct mention, the possibility of hidden companions remains just that, a possibility. But the Silk Road was rarely traveled alone. Caravans were safer than solitary travel, and strangers could easily become companions for weeks or months before parting ways. A handful of men in plain clothes riding beside bales of silk might leave no trace in the chronicles, but they could still leave an impression in the guarded, oblique language of those who noticed them. If Marco Polo did have such companions, they may have blended so seamlessly into his journey that they passed into history as shadows behind a brighter light, and perhaps that was exactly the way they wanted it. The idea of a Templar knight standing in the court of a Mongol Khan is not just a flourish for historical fiction. It is a scenario that rests on the real and documented fact that Western envoys were received in those vast smoky halls. The Khans understood the value of foreign visitors, particularly those who brought news of distant powers, potential alliances, or exotic goods, and the Templars, disciplined, well-traveled, and politically savvy, would have been exactly the sort of guests whose presence could be exploited for both diplomacy and display. We know that the Mongols maintained elaborate protocols for receiving foreign delegations. Accounts from men like William of Rubeck describe a process that was as much a test as a welcome days spent in waiting camps, interrogations by interpreters, ceremonial presentations of gifts, and finally, an audience in a great tent or palace hung with silk. Here, before the Khan himself, each visitor was expected to bow, speak according to his rank, and make his business plain. The Khan would listen, question, and perhaps make his own proposal in return. A knight of the temple trained to handle delicate negotiations would have been at home in such a ritual, though he might have bristled at the required gestures of deference. The tantalizing question is whether such meetings happened after the order's suppression in 1307. Officially, the papacy sent no Templar embassies to the Mongols after that date, but unofficially the channels established in earlier decades may have remained open. Persian historian Rashid Allen, whose access to the Mongol elite was unparalleled, records the visit of Frankish warriors to Ghazan Khan's court in Tabriz around 1309. He notes that they brought military gifts, bows of superior craftsmanship, steel-tipped lances, and armor designed to withstand arrows. While he does not name their origin, he remarks that their leader spoke the language of the Franks and had the bearing of one accustomed to command. It is here that speculation ignites. Could this leader have been a former Templar officer seeking to establish himself, and perhaps his surviving brothers, in Mongol service? The timing fits neatly into the post-suppression period, when exemplars would have been seeking both protection and purpose. Such a meeting would also explain how knowledge of Mongol military organization hinted at in the mysterious map's notations could have been acquired firsthand. Those who doubt the theory point out that many European mercenaries, including Genoa and Catalan fighters, entered Mongol service in this era. The Frankish warriors could have been any of these, particularly given the Mediterranean trade links that connected trees to the Black Sea. Yet the Templars, unlike most mercenaries, had both the resources to outfit such an embassy and the motivation to negotiate terms that went beyond mere pay. An alliance with the Khan could have provided them not just safe haven, but a base from which to influence events far to the west. From the Mongol perspective, welcoming such men would have been a calculated move. The Khans valued military specialists, especially those skilled in siege warfare, a field in which the Templars had centuries of experience. The sight of foreign knights riding under Mongol banners would have been a potent symbol, a reminder to both allies and enemies that the Khan's reach extended into the very heart of Europe's warrior class. And if these knights also brought with them knowledge of European politics, trade, and fortification, so much the better. There is an obscure Chinese source from the Yuan dynasty that, while not naming the Templars, describes Western warriors serving in the forces of the great Khan's cousins. These men, the source claims, wore armor like mirrors and carried long swords unusual to the steppe. They fought not as horse archers, but as heavy cavalry breaking enemy lines with sheer force. While such descriptions could fit other Western troops, the emphasis on their discipline and formation has led some scholars to wonder whether these were veterans of a crusading order. If such meetings and negotiations took place, they would explain the deliberate precision of the route mapped toward Karakorum. A Templar envoy traveling to meet the Khan would have needed not just the safest road, but one that passed through reliable waypoints, Armenian allies, Nistran hosts, and Mongol-guarded caravans arise. The lines on the map are not the haphazard wanderings of a trader chasing profit. They are the backbone of a diplomatic mission, the path of a man who knows where he must be and when. Of course, the central mystery remains unresolved. Did the Templars approach the Khans as supplicants seeking refuge, as equals seeking alliance, or as subtle rivals seeking to shape the East for their own ends? Each possibility casts the story in a different light, and the surviving fragments of evidence can be made to support all three. What is certain is that the meeting off the temple and the Khan is no longer an impossibility to be dismissed. It is a point on the map where two very different visions of power might have briefly overlapped and perhaps for a moment even aligned. History loves paper because it speaks clearly: names, dates, places neatly inked into lines that can be read aloud centuries later. But coins whisper in a different way. They are silent, weighty, and stubborn. They cross borders without passports, pass through hands without signatures, and can lie buried for hundreds of years before revealing the story they carry in their metal skin. When it comes to tracing possible Templar movement, eastward coins and other small portable relics may be the most tangible clues we have. Asterisk in the dry soil of caravanserai ruins scattered along the old Silk Road. Archaeologists have uncovered the occasional European coin among heaps of Chinese copper cash, Persian dirhams, and Mongol silver ingots. At first glance, these seem unsurprising. Merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Pisa traded along these routes, and their currency naturally traveled with them. Yet, a few finds have raised eyebrows. Asterisk. One hoard discovered near Nishaper contained several silver deniers minted by the Templars in Acre in the late 13th century coins, marked with the order's distinctive cross and legend. The official interpretation is that these arrived via trade, long after the order's fall. But the concentration of such coins in a site tied more to military garrisons than to civilian markets invites a different line of thought. Similarly, in a dig outside the Armenian city of Ani, a cluster of graves dated to the early 14th century yielded belt fittings, a sword pommel of Western design, and a single coin from the French royal mint, minted during the reign of Philip IV, the very king who ordered the Templars' arrest. That coin's presence there is almost theatrical in its irony, as if a silent reminder of the events that had driven its owner far from home. The archaeologists noted that the graves appeared to belong to mounted warriors, though whether they were mercenaries, pilgrims, or members of a disbanded order could not be determined. Even more intriguing is the occasional appearance of Templar seals, or seal impressions, in unexpected places. A clay bulla found near Trebor, a cross pate, within a double circle, a design strongly associated with the order's European chancelleries. Seal designs could be copied or reused, of course, but the style and execution of this one matched examples from Cyprus in the years just before 1307. If genuine, it suggests that some official correspondence of Templar origin passed through Persian hands, and perhaps not through the formal channels of crown or papacy. Skeptics argue that these objects prove only that goods and symbols travel farther than people. A coin can change hands dozens of times before reaching its resting place. A seal matrix could be sold, stolen, or simply carried as a curiosity by someone who had never seen a Templar in his life. Yet, when such items appear repeatedly along routes we already suspect were used for covert movement, they begin to form a pattern, one of alignment between geography, artifact, and historical possibility. One scholarly debate centers on whether the distinctive concentration of Western artifacts in certain Silk Road garrisons reflects a period of deeper European integration into Mongol military structures. If so, and if some of these artifacts match the period immediately after the Templar suppression, then the idea of former brothers finding new patrons becomes less fanciful. The coins in particular would make sense. A man traveling with his own funds, rather than being paid by an employer, might carry the currency he trusted and knew, and in the Templars' case, their own minted silver would have been as much a symbol of identity as a means of trade. The mysterious map we keep returning to seems to favor waypoints where such finds have turned up. Caravan towns in Persia, fortified stops in Armenia, and certain river crossings in Central Asia all match locations where archaeologists have documented Western coins or military relics. Coincidence? Possibly. But it is a coincidence that keeps repeating itself in a way suggestive of deliberate paths rather than random dispersal. The most tantalizing and frustrating aspect of these discoveries is how little context survives with them. A coin in the dust can tell you where it ended up, but not who dropped it or why. It cannot tell you whether it was lost in battle, slipped from a purse on a quiet road, or deliberately buried as part of a soldier's pay chest, and so each find becomes another small puzzle piece, its edges blurred, fitting into multiple possible pictures. Yet, there is something undeniably evocative about the thought of a Templar denier lying hidden for centuries beneath Persian soil, only to be lifted into the light by a modern archaeologist's brush. The coin says nothing, but in its silence, it mirrors the very nature of this mystery, a relic of presence without the certainty of proof, a trace that demands you imagine the hand that once held it. And if enough such traces can be found, perhaps, the whisper will grow into a voice. If the Templars had a foothold in the East, it was likely to be found in the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. Perched between the Mediterranean and the highlands that led into Anatolia and the Caucasus Cilician, Armenia was a natural bridge geographically, politically, and culturally. For centuries, it had been a vital ally of the Crusader states, and its ports and mountain passes formed one of the safest corridors between Europe and the deeper reaches of Asia, for men seeking to travel toward Mongol lands without attracting the full glare of hostile eyes. It offered both cover and cooperation by the late 13th and early 14th centuries. The kingdom was ruled by the Lusinian dynasty, an offshoot of the Frankish nobility of Cyprus. This meant that its royal court operated in a kind of hybrid mode, Armenian in heritage, but Latin in many of its alliances and ceremonies. The Templars had been present in Cilicia since at least the mid-12th century, holding estates, guarding trade routes, and assisting in military campaigns against common enemies. Even after the loss of the Crusader strongholds in the Levant, the order maintained a role here, offering military aid in exchange for privileges in commerce and landholding. This is where the bridge becomes more than a metaphor. The mountain passes leading from Cilicia into Armenia proper were dotted with fortresses, many of which the Templars had helped garrison. These strong points not only guarded against raids, but also controlled the movement of caravans heading toward the interior. A Templar presence here could ensure that certain travelers, perhaps those with urgent and discreet destinations, passed without hindrance. In some cases, they may even have provided escort through particularly dangerous stretches. An obscure entry in the Armenian royal chancery records, dated to just after 1307, grants safe conduct to Latin brothers and their companions traveling eastward in the service of the kingdom. The record does not explain the purpose of their journey, nor does it name the order involved. Yet the timing is hard to ignore. It falls squarely in the window when Templar fugitives would have been seeking routes out of Europe and the Levant. The mention of service to the kingdom could be a diplomatic fig leaf, masking a mission whose real goals were known only to a handful of people. Armenian chroniclers of the period Also note the kingdom's close relationship with the Mongol Ilkhanate. Armenian kings provided troops for Mongol campaigns against Muslim powers, and in return the Mongols granted them autonomy and protection. This alliance created an unusual dynamic. Armenian-controlled territory became a rare, safe space where Latin Christian forces could operate with the tacit approval of the Mongols. For a displaced Templar, such an arrangement would be invaluable, allowing movement deeper into Asia under the umbrella of both Armenian and Mongol authority. Skeptics will argue that the Armenian kingdom was already stretched thin by this period, facing constant threats from the Mammals and internal disputes among its nobility. Hosting a stream of fugitive knights might have been more burden than benefit, yet the Armenians had long practiced the art of calculated hospitality, extending protection to those who could contribute militarily or financially. If even a handful of Templars brought with them experience in siegecraft, the discipline of mounted warfare, or simply gold from the Order's scattered treasuries, they would have been worth accommodating. The archaeological record offers a few glimmers here in the ruins of a fortress near the Cilician Gate. The strategic pass into central Anatolia excavators found a set of iron stirrups and spurs of Western design dated roughly to the early 14th century. Such items could have arrived through trade, but their association with a military outpost lends weight to the idea of Western riders using these roses at the time. Similarly, a fragment of a carved stone crosspate was recovered from a church near Sis, the Armenian capital. Though its style is plain enough to resist definitive attribution, the Armenian bridge thus becomes a convergence of geography and alliance. It connected the Mediterranean to the Caucasus and Persia, but also Latin Christendom to the Mongol sphere through a loyal intermediary. It is easy to picture the road, a column of pack animals winding through penicented passes, Armenian guards at the front, a scattering of plain-clad riders in their midst, who, if you looked closely, sat their horses with the unshakable seat of knights trained for war. Behind them lay the ports of Cyprus or the Levant. Ahead, the open steppe. Was this bridge a one-time crossing for a desperate few, or part of a regular if secretive route eastward? The surviving records are too fragmentary to say. But in a story built on fragments, Cilician Armenia stands out as one of the most plausible staging grounds for Templars intent on reaching the Mongol world. Here the map's lines tighten, funneling into a narrow corridor before spilling outward again into the vastness beyond, and if you were a knight with nowhere left to stand in the west, this might be the last place that still felt, if not like home, then at least like safety. If the Templars ever reached the farthest limits of the Silk Road, they would have walked into a world where their presence might be recorded not in Latin charters or papal bulls, but in the elegant brushstrokes of Chinese historians. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, China was under the rule of the Yuan dynasty, a Mongol regime that viewed the compilation of detailed histories as part of its statecraft. These chronicles, written in classical Chinese, preserve accounts of foreign embassies, unusual envoys, and military advisors who served the khans. And buried in those accounts are a few passages that have made certain historians pause. The official Yuan Shu, the history of the Yan, contains several references to Fangji, or Franks, a term broadly used to describe Western Europeans. Most entries are vague, simply noting the arrival of envoys bearing tribute or requests for trade. But in one section dated to the reign of Tamer Khan, 1294-307, there is mention of a group of Western warriors who arrived bearing arms and armor of foreign forging and offered their service in the defense of frontier garrisons. The chronicler remarks that their helmets were tall and shining, their swords longer than those of the steppe, and their tactics like those of the southern seas, a phrase some sinologists interpret as meaning Mediterranean or Levantine in origin. No direct connection to the Templars is stated, and in truth, the term Franks could encompass crusaders, mercenaries, or even traders from Italian city-states. Yet the description of disciplined heavy cavalry, so alien to the Mongol Lighthorse tradition, align with the kind of martial skill the Templars were famed for. If any such warriors were indeed former members of the order, their appearance here suggests that at least a few may have traveled far beyond Persia or the Mongol capitals of Central Asia, pressing on to the very heart of the Khan's dominion. There is also a curious account in a less formal text, the Miscellany, known as the Jingshi Dadian, a compendium of administrative notes and observations. In it, a clerk describes a Western visitor who presented the Khan with a map of roads from the Sea of the West to the city of the Khan. The map, according to the note, marked way stations, rivers, and fortified houses kept by the followers of the cross. The phrase is ambiguous. It could refer to Christian churches or hospices along the way, but to a modern reader, it recalls the Templar prectories and the mysterious chart that opened our investigation. Skeptics caution against reading too much into these mentions. Chinese chroniclers were not always precise in distinguishing one group of Westerners from another, and the accounts are often filtered through multiple translations from Latin or Persian into Mongolian, then into Chinese. Errors in identification were inevitable. Yet, the persistence of the image-armed Western writers organized and equipped in a style unusual for ordinary merchants is difficult to ignore. An intriguing side note comes from Yuan-era Buddhist sources, which, though primarily concerned with religious matters, occasionally mention foreign soldiers as protectors of temples or escorts for high-ranking clergy traveling along dangerous routes. One temple record from near Dunhuang notes the arrival of Red Cross guards with a caravan described as speaking an unfamiliar tongue and refusing to remove their swords even during religious rites. While Red Cross might simply refer to the color of their gear or banners, the parallel to the Templar emblem is an enticing one. For supporters of the Eastern Templar theory, these scattered Chinese references form the far end of the thread, first spun in the Levant. If the order's survivors were indeed seeking to ally themselves with the Mongols, then reaching the Yuan capital Kelek would have been the ultimate diplomatic and strategic goal. The Khans there commanded the eastern half of the empire, with influence that could ripple back through Persia and into the Mediterranean world. The presence of Western warriors in their court, whether few or many, could signal that the Templar mission, whatever it was, had reached its final destination. The challenge is that by the early 14th century, the Yuan dynasty was beginning to lose some of its cohesion. Factionalism at court, tension between Mongol and Chinese elites, and the immense distances involved made it difficult to sustain consistent policies toward foreign allies. If the Templars did make it this far, they might have found the political ground shifting beneath their feet. Perhaps they entered Mongol service, only to be reassigned to far-flung garrisons, their original mission forgotten. Or perhaps they achieved an audience with the Khan, but found his interest in Western affairs waning. Whatever the case, the Chinese chronicles leave us with an image that is both vivid and frustratingly incomplete. The flash of metal in the sun, the glint of tall helmets, and the disciplined line of riders, whose origins were recorded simply as Fanji. Whether they were indeed the last echo of the temple in the east, or just another wave of Western adventurers, their presence in the Yuan record keeps the possibility alive that the Templar road did not end in Persia or Karakorum, but reached all the way to the gates of the great Khan's city. If the Templars ever reached the Mongol world, they would have stepped into a military culture unlike anything they had known in the West. The Mongols had built their empire not on the static defense of fortresses, but on movement fast, relentless, and devastating. Their armies could ride 100 miles in a day, surround an enemy before dawn, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. Against such speed, the Templars' heavy cavalry tactics would have seemed slow and deliberate. Yet, it is precisely in this contrast that the most intriguing possibilities arise. The Mongols admired skill, regardless of origin. They were quick to absorb the methods of any opponent who could teach them something useful, whether that meant siegecraft from Chinese engineers, naval operations from Korean shipwrights, or fortification techniques from Persian architects. The Templars, for their part, had centuries of experience in the art of defending and storming fortified positions. They knew how to coordinate cavalry with infantry, how to use disciplined charges to break enemy lines, and how to turn a narrow pass or bridge into an impenetrable choke point. There are scattered hints in both Mongol and Persian sources that Western heavy cavalry served in certain Mongol campaigns during the early 14th century. One account describes armored riders from the farthest lands who fought alongside Mongol forces in a battle near the Caucasus. They were positioned not as scouts or skirmishers, but as a shock unit unleashed at a critical moment to drive through enemy ranks. Such tactics bear the stamp of Western knighthood. And while they could have been executed by other European mercenaries, the discipline and cohesion described are reminiscent of a trained order. It is tempting to imagine the cross-pollination of techniques that might have occurred if Templars trained alongside Mongol warriors. The knight would learn to ride light and fast, to loose arrows from the saddle at full gallop, to fight in looser formations than the rigid lines of European warfare. The Mongol in turn might study the art of the couched lance, the precise timing of a heavy cavalry charge, and the coordinated dismount and fight maneuvers that the Templars had perfected in the Levant. Over weeks and months, the exchange could yield hybrid tactics, neither purely European nor purely step-born, a fusion of sword and bow. A particularly obscure detail comes from an Armenian chronicle that mentions a group of Latin riders teaching certain Mongol troops to fight on foot in tight ranks when storming fortified gates. This is not a typical Mongol practice, as their strength lay in mobility and missile fire. But in the siege of walled cities, such skills could be decisive. The chronicler's tone is almost grudging in acknowledging the value of these foreigners, noting that their methods were strange but effective. Skeptics might argue that such military blending could have been achieved by any number of Western soldiers in Mongol service, and they are not wrong. Yet, the Templars' particular blend of discipline, battlefield communication, and adaptability would have made them ideal candidates for such disarming. Moreover, the Order's rule had long emphasized learning from the enemy. In the Crusader states, they had borrowed tactics from their Muslim adversaries, incorporating lighter cavalry and feigned retreats into their repertoire. The leap to absorbing Mongol methods would not have been so large. The strategic implications of such an exchange are tantalizing. If the Templars were indeed integrating Mongol tactics into their own skill set, they might have been preparing for a role that went beyond mere survival. Perhaps they envisioned themselves as intermediaries, military brokers, who could translate the art of war between East and West. In a world where the Crusades had failed and European powers were fracturing, Such a role could have offered the order a new relevance and a new home. One can imagine a Templar watching a Mongol archer lose 6 arrows before a European knight could ready his second, and realizing that the future of warfare lay not in sheer armor and mass, but in speed and precision. Likewise, a Mongol commander might see the value in the armored wedge of a disciplined charge, its weight breaking the enemy line for the swifter horseman to exploit. These moments of mutual recognition, unrecorded, fleeting, might have been the true treasure exchanged on the steppes, more enduring than any gold or relic. And here, the mysterious map takes on yet another layer of meaning. Its notations may not simply mark routes and resting places. They could also record the locations of specific Mongol garrisons or training grounds where such exchanges took place. To a casual observer, these would be meaningless points on a line. To the map's maker, they might represent the very places where the sword learned from the bow and the bow from the sword. Whether this fusion of tactics ever reached the battlefields of Europe is unknown. If the Templars brought it back, it left little trace in the chronicles of the 100 Years' War or other conflicts of the 14th century. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps in the vast and shifting game of survival, after 1307, learning to fight like a Mongol was less about conquest and more about ensuring that the Knights of the Temple could ride another day. If the Templars left traces in the East, they might not be found only in coins or chronicles, but in symbols carved into stone, painted on walls, or woven into cloth. Heraldry was more than decoration for the order. It was identity, authority, and a declaration of purpose. A red cross, on a white field, was as unmistakable in the medieval world as a royal seal. And while fleeing Templars would not have worn it openly, the language of symbols is hard to unlearn. Even in hiding, they may have left subtle marks for those who knew how to read them. Across Central Asia, in regions once patrolled by Mongol armies and crisscrossed by Silk Road caravans, archaeologists have occasionally found architectural and decorative motifs that seem oddly out of place. In certain ruined caravans arise in Persia and the Caucasus, there are carved crosses whose proportions match Western heraldic forms more closely than local Christian styles. In some cases, these crosses are tucked away above a doorframe, in the keystone of an arch, or in the corner of a relief crowded with more familiar Islamic or Mongol motifs. One of the more debated examples comes from a ruined watchtower near Samarkand, where a weathered stone block bears a shallowly carved crosspaint, its arms flaring outward in the exact proportion found on Templar seals. The tower itself is dated to the early 14th century, and is believed to have been part of a Mongol-era military outpost. The orthodox explanation is that the stone was spolia, reused from an earlier building, perhaps a church or hospice. But the fact that it was placed high and visible, rather than hidden, has led some to wonder if it was intentionally displayed as a sign to certain travelers. Textile evidence is even more tantalizing. A fragment of silk from a burial site in the Tarim Basin bears an embroidered pattern of small red crosses, each set within a lozenge. The burial is dated roughly between 1300 and 1320. While geometric patterns were common in both Mongol and Central Asian textiles, the consistent form of the cross, neither Greek nor Armenian in style, has drawn attention from historians familiar with Western heraldry. Was it a trade good from Europe? A personal garment repurposed for burial, or a quiet emblem carried by someone far from home? Skeptics urge caution, noting that the cross is a universal symbol appearing in many cultures independently. The similarity to Templar designs may be coincidence, especially in regions with long-standing Christian communities like the niche. But supporters of the Eastern Templar theory argue that context matters when such motifs appear in places and periods that align with known eastward roots. The same roots traced on the mysterious map, the possibility of deliberate placement grows stronger. There is also the matter of encoded marks. Medieval orders often used simple geometric signs scratched into wood or stone as private signals, directions to safe lodgings, signs of a completed delivery, or warnings to avoid a certain road. These marks could be as inconspicuous as a small cross within a circle or a pair of intersecting lines tilted at a specific angle. In several Central Asian caravans, restorers have documented such incised signs near thresholds and along stairwells. While attributing them to a specific group is almost impossible, the temptation is to imagine a fugitive brother of the temple pausing to cut a quiet message for those who might follow. One obscure Persian travelogue, written by a Muslim merchant around 1315, describes meeting foreign riders who marked their tents with a red device, but only when among friends. The device is not illustrated, but the note is intriguing for its suggestion of conditional display, a sign shown only to trusted eyes. This practice would fit the needs of men moving through politically unstable territory, signaling identity to allies without drawing unwanted attention from others. If the Templars did use such symbols in the East, their purpose would not have been vanity. They would have been tools of navigation and recognition, part of the same clandestine infrastructure that might have included preceptories, Nestorian contacts, and merchant caravans. The marks could guide a rider from the Armenian highlands to the heart of the steppe, linking distant waypoints into a network invisible to outsiders. The great frustration, of course, is that symbols are as easy to misread as they are to hide. A cross might be a Templar sign, a local Christian decoration, or simply an ornamental flourish borrowed from another culture. Yet, the persistence of these motifs along the Silk Road's arteries, often in locations where other fragments of possible Templar presence have been noted, is difficult to write off entirely, and so the image lingers, a weathered cross high on a tower, catching the last light of day, an embroidered lozenge with its tiny red mark folded into the grave clothes of someone who had traveled far, a scratched symbol on a stone arch, invisible unless you knew to look for it. These are the faint fingerprints of a journey whose full story remains hidden, but whose traces scattered in the dust of the steppe may yet be pieced together. Every long road collects myths, the way a river gathers silt, and the Silk Road was no exception. Traders and pilgrims alike carried not only goods, but stories of distant mountains, hidden cities and lands, untouched by the corruption of the wider world. One of these was the legend of Shambhala, a mystical kingdom somewhere beyond the Himalayas, or deep in the Asian interior. In Buddhist tradition, Shambhala was a place of wisdom and peace, invisible to the unworthy, its rulers destined to lead a final battle against darkness. To Western ears, such a place sounded like both paradise and fortress, a combination that naturally invites speculation when paired with the fate of the Templars. The Shambhala rumor, as it relates to the Templars, is not a medieval invention, but but a later grafting one that appears in the writings of 18th and 19th century European explorers and occultists. They looked back at the gaps in the Templar story and wondered, could the Order's survivors have sought out this hidden kingdom, hoping to find sanctuary among its enlightened rulers? It is an enticing thought, but one that requires careful handling because the more mystical layers you add, the further you risk drifting from the historical bedrock. And yet, there are earlier hints of a similar idea in more grounded sources. Some Persian chronicles speak of Western warriors traveling far beyond the main Mongol cities, into regions where the rulers follow the law of neither prophet nor pope. The phrasing is dismissive, yet curious, implying polities that were neither Islamic nor Christian, and yet significant enough to be noticed. Could these references point to remote Buddhist or syncretic states in the mountains of Tibet or the high plateaus of Central Asia? If so, they might be the real-world shadows that later generations inflated into the myth of Shambhala. Templars stripped of their European bases after 1307 would have been drawn to any place offering both remoteness and the promise of military protection. The deeper they traveled into Mongol territory, the more they would have encountered stories of lands that were self-sufficient, wealthy, and insulated from the politics of the Khan's courts. For a brotherhood accustomed to secrecy, the idea of disappearing into such a place would have been appealing. Even if Shambhala itself was legend, the concept of a secure hidden redoubt was entirely practical. There is also the matter of cultural translation. Medieval travelers often mapped foreign concepts onto familiar ones. A European might describe a Buddhist monastery as a fortress of monks, or a remote mountain polity as a kingdom of the priest-kings. To someone steeped in Templar ideals, a distant theocratic stronghold could icily be imagined as a kind of Eastern mirror to the Order's own combination of martial and religious life. It is not hard to picture a Templar hearing a translator recount tales of a hidden Buddhist city and seeing in it a reflection of what the temple might become in exile. Skeptics point out that no medieval European source explicitly connects the Templars to Shambhala by name. The earliest such connections appear centuries later, in works colored heavily by Romanticism and esotericism from a historian standpoint. This makes the Shambhala link more a product of retrospective imagination than of contemporary evidence. Still, the persistence of similar motifs in earlier accounts. Remote fortified sanctuaries, orders of warrior monks, in the east lands of great wealth and wisdom beyond the Mongol frontier, keeps the door open for a real kernel beneath the legend. One of the more obscure clues comes from a Tibetan manuscript describing the visit of men from the land where the sun falls to a high-altitude monastery in the early 14th century. These men, the text says, were skilled in arms and wore armor, like the moon, a poetic phrase that could describe polished steel. They are said to have stayed through the winter, teaching the monks the art of defending gates with long shields. The account is not dated precisely, nor is it corroborated by other Tibetan sources, but it sits tantalizingly close to the right period for post-suppression Templars moving east. Here, the mysterious map drifts back into the conversation once more. Its terminus in Mongolia is clear. But what if the map was only part of a larger chart? A section leading further toward lands deliberately left blank for all but the initiated. If the Templars had heard of a sanctuary beyond the Khan's authority, perhaps even beyond the reach of Mongol roads, They might have carried such knowledge in their heads, rather than risk it on parchment. In the end, whether Shambhala was a real destination, or a dream woven from fragments of truth, it fits the emotional logic of the Templar eastward journey. It offers an ending that is neither defeat nor assimilation, but transformation. The order remade in a hidden place, waiting for a time to emerge. Historically plausible perhaps only in part. But, in a story stitched together from whispers, absences, and the occasional coin in the dust, the Shambhala rumor remains one of the most enduring and evocative threads. If the Templars truly traveled east after their suppression, the journey would not have been an abstract leap from one world to another, but a sequence of tangible roads, rivers, and passes, each with its own dangers and demands. The path from Jerusalem to the Mongol capital of Karakoram was not a single route carved into the earth, but a flexible chain of options, each dictated by shifting alliances, seasonal hazards, and the political weather of the year. Mapping such a journey means tracing both geography and strategy. The first stage leaving the Levant would have been the most dangerous. By the early 14th century, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land had collapsed, with Acre falling in 1291. Surviving, Templars in the region operated from Cyprus, or from isolated holdings in Seleucian Armenia. Departing from either point meant choosing between two primary arteries: the sea lane's two ports in the Black Sea, or the overland road through Armenian and Georgian territory. The maritime route was faster, but exposed travelers to storms, piracy, and the scrutiny of port officials loyal to the papacy or hostile rulers. The overland route was slower, but allowed for more control over who saw you come and go. From the Armenian highlands, the road eastward could split again. One branch threaded through the Caucasus, skirting the Caspian Sea, and descending into the plains of Shirvan, before reaching Persia. Another cut southeast following the Araxes River, toward Tabor, the Elkhanate capital. Tabor was a bustling hub, a city of markets, embassies, and Mongol administrative centers. For anyone seeking to pass deeper into the empire, it was the place to acquire the necessary documents, or pesa, the imperial tablet, granting the bearer rights of passage, supplies, and relay horses. From Persia, the main Silk Road routes offered to broad approaches to Central Asia. The northern road ran through the great cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, crossing the Amu Darya into the heart of the steppe. This road had the advantage of established caravan networks and relatively flat terrain, but also left travelers exposed to the fierce climate and to raids in times when Mongol authority wavered. The southern road curved through Karuzan, then east toward Balkh, skirting the Hindu Kush before entering the wide valleys leading toward Kashgar. This path was more mountainous, but allowed for detours into regions where local rulers, some of them Buddhist or Nistaran, might be more sympathetic to foreign Christians. Relay stations under Mongol control provided food and fresh mounts, but only to those whose documents and allegiances were in order. A former Templar commander plotting such a route would have thought in terms of control points, places where safety could be secured, supplies replenished, and information exchanged. Armenian fortresses at the western edge, and Taurian communities scattered through Persia. Caravanserayas in Khorasan, fortified outposts along the Amu Darya, each would serve as a bead on the thread, linking west to east. In the Mongol heartlands, the thread would pass through major Ordu, the mobile courts of the Kay, before reaching the permanent structures at Karakoram. It is worth remembering that Karakorum, though later overshadowed by the move of the capital to Kabbalic Beijing, was in the early 14th century still a potent symbol of Mongol unity and authority. Its Great Hall, described by William of Rub decades earlier, was a meeting place where envoys from across the known world presented tribute. A Templar arrival here, whether in an official or covert capacity, would have been the culmination of a journey measured not only in miles, but in the careful negotiation of every checkpoint, every gate, every watchful eye. An obscure travel account preserved in Armenian sources describes a party of Latin men reaching a Mongol court in the land of the deer banners, a poetic reference some associate with the Mongol standard at Karakorum. These men, the account claims, presented gifts of iron and gold and carried a sealed letter from a king beyond the Western Sea. The account is frustratingly short on detail, but its geographic markers fit the final leg of the route to the old capital. Whether they were merchants, envoys, or displaced knights remains an open question. The mysterious map that sparked our journey appears to follow the southern approach, marking Trebok and Kashgar, before ending near the Orchan River, the lifeline of Karakorum. This precision is what lends it its unsettling weight. It is not the work of a dreamer drawing imagined lands, but of someone who knew the order of the road, who had heard from those who traveled it, or traveled it themselves. From Jerusalem to Karakorum was a journey of over 5,000 miles through deserts, mountains, and steppes. For a Templar fugitive, it was not just a test of endurance, but of adaptability, diplomacy, and the ability to disappear into the living river of traders, pilgrims, and warriors moving through the heart of the world. Each mile would carry them further from the courts that condemned them and closer to the power they might hope would shelter them. Long before the Templars were accused, arrested, and scattered, there had been another vision for their future, one that might have carried them east under the brightest banners of Christendom, rather than through shadows. In the mid to late 13th century, as the Crusader states tottered and the Mamluks pressed their advantage, an audacious plan began to circulate among the courts of Europe and the Levant, a joint Mongol Crusader campaign through Persia, striking into the heart of the Muslim world to reclaim Jerusalem. It was a plan that, if realized, might have given the Templars both a new theater of war and an unassailable alliance. Instead, it died in the air. But its ghost may have haunted the order's thinking for decades afterward. The proposal hinged on a rare moment when interests aligned. The Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia, under rulers like Hulagu and later Abaka Khan, was locked in conflict with the Mamluks of Egypt and Syria. The Crusader Order's Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights had seen their strongholds fall one by one to the same enemy. The papacy, aware that European enthusiasm for the Crusades was waning, began to entertain the idea of an alliance with these formidable horsemen from the east. Such an alliance, if channeled through Persia, could open a secure corridor for army supplies and reinforcements, effectively bypassing the bottlenecks and disasters of previous crusading efforts. Concrete steps were taken. Envoys shuttled between Mongol courts and the capitals of Europe. In 1262, Hulagu sent letters to Louis IX of France, proposing coordinated action. Later, Abaka renewed the offer, and there were moments when troops actually moved in loose coordination, though never in the decisive unified strike that planners imagined. The Templars were aware of these overtures. Indeed, they may have been directly involved in receiving Mongol embassies and assessing their military proposals. For an order obsessed with both the defense of the Holy Land and the control of strategic routes, the Persian corridor would have been irresistible, but suspicion ran deep. Some European leaders recoiled at the idea of trusting the same people who had devastated Eastern Europe only a generation earlier. The Mongols, for their part, were pragmatic. Their offers of alliance always came with expectations of submission or tribute, and their patience for religious diplomacy was finite. Papal correspondence reveals hesitation with repeated calls for the Mongols to accept baptism as a condition for any meaningful partnership. The Khans, unsurprisingly, were not eager to subordinate themselves to Rome. By the 1280s the grand plan had begun to wither. The Mamluks scored decisive victories. The Mongols faced internal fractures, and the appetite in Europe for another massive eastern expedition dwindled. The idea of a Persian crusade faded into the background, becoming one of many what-ifs in the long decline of the Crusader dream. Yet for the Templars, the vision may not have died entirely. Even in failure, the diplomatic groundwork had been laid, contacts established in Persia, knowledge of routes and logistics gathered, and the precedent of cooperation set. However, briefly, when the order was dissolved in 1307, these dormant channels would have been among the few threads they could still tug, especially if fleeing to the Mongol sphere became a matter of survival rather than ambition. There's a detail in one Armenian chronicle that feels almost like an echo of this unrealized campaign. It describes a small company of Latin knights passing through Cilicia en route to Persia around 1310, seeking to fulfill an oath made in years past. The chronicler offers no further explanation, but the phrasing invites speculation. Could these men have been clinging to the remnants of the Persian crusade plan, carrying it forward not as a papal mandate, but as a personal or secret mission? Supporters of the Eastern Templar theory see in this failed crusade the seed of a later, quieter movement. The same roads and alliances meant for a grand military coalition could just as easily serve smaller covert parties. The Persian Crusade's logistical blueprint ports, mountain passes, Mongol-guarded caravan routes could be repurposed for an exodus rather than an invasion. The Templars had already tested these channels under the banner of diplomacy. Now they might use them under the cloak of necessity. Skeptics, however, point out that by 1307, the Mongol Empire was no longer the unified force it had been in Hulag's time. The Ilkhanate was embroiled in its own succession struggles, and its capacity to project power toward the Levant was diminished. A Templar seeking refuge there might find less stability than the old crusade plans had promised. And yet the idea of Persia, as a gateway first for conquest, later for survival, persisted. It appears again faintly, but recognizably in the mysterious map that has followed us through this investigation. The map's early segments match closely with routes proposed in the Persian crusade plans down to certain waypoints in Armenia and Kharuzan. If the map's creator had once trained for that long-abandoned campaign, perhaps their later journey was simply a different kind of mission along a familiar road. In this way, the Persian crusade that never was becomes more than a footnote. It is a bridge between the Templars' public role as defenders of Christendom and their possible private role as fugitives seeking a new place in the world. The road was drawn in their minds long before they needed it. And when the hour came, they may simply have ridden it in reverse. If the overland routes through Armenia and Persia formed one spine of the eastward journey, the Black Sea was its restless, shifting flank, a body of water whose ports and currents could carry a man halfway to the steppes before he ever set foot on a caravan road. For the Templars, who had long maintained ships in the Mediterranean, the sea offered both a risk and a refuge. In the years after 1307, when roads were watched, an overland passage could be choked by unfriendly rulers. The idea of slipping away under sail into the mist of the Pontic coast might have seemed like the cleanest escape. By the early 14th century, the Black Sea was ringing with a patchwork of powers. Genoese trading colonies at Kotha and Saya, Byzantine ports still clinging to their importance, and towns under the sway of Mongol kites like the Golden Horde. This created a rare mix of jurisdictions, some fiercely loyal to papal decrees, others entirely indifferent to them. A fugitive knight could vanish into a city where the Pope's writ held no sway, boarding a ship that sailed beyond the gossip of European courts. The Genoese colonies were particularly important nodes in this network. Kaffa on the Crimean coast was a major entrepot linking Mediterranean commerce with the caravan trails of the Eurasian interior. Ships from Cyprus or the Ion could dock here under the pretext of trade, unload goods and quietly take on passengers bound for the Mongol-controlled ports and riverways further north and east. It was here, according to one fragmentary Genoese ledger, that a payment was made in 1312 for a special convoy to the Tatars, a phrase vague enough to mean anything but suggestive when paired with the names of vessels known to have carried mixed cargoes of goods and armed escorts. From the Black Sea coast, rivers like the Don and Dniester could carry travelers inland toward the heart of the Golden Horde's territories. The Horde, though politically separate from the Ilkhanate in Persia, still shared the Mongol heritage of relative religious tolerance, and its rulers were pragmatic in dealing with skilled foreigners. Latin merchants operated in its markets, and there are accounts of European craftsmen and soldiers in its service. For a displaced Templar, the Horde's lands might have served as a staging ground, a place to regroup, learn the rhythms of the steppe, and decide whether to push on toward Persia or Karakorum. One obscure Byzantine chronicle written in the 1320s describes Latin warriors arriving in Trebizond by sea and then departing northward to the land of the horse lords. The chronicler's tone is disapproving, as though these men were abandoning their rightful duties, but he notes their discipline and the fine condition of their arms. There is no direct identification of them as Templars, yet their timing barely a few years after the order's suppression invites speculation. Skeptics note that the Black Sea trade routes were crowded with all kinds of Europeans, merchants from Venice and Genoa, mercenaries, seeking employment with Mongol or Byzantine employers, and pilgrims bound for remote Christian communities. Any of these could match the chronicler's description. But supporters of the Eastern Templar theory point to the order's naval experience, their familiarity with both merchant and military logistics, and their ability to operate across multiple jurisdictions as evidence that this maritime escape was not only possible, but probable, for some. The mysterious map we have returned to so often does not clearly depict the Black Sea. Yet in the margin near its western edge, there is a faint line that could be read as a sea route connecting at Levantine port to a point in Crimea before joining the main overland trail. If genuine, it suggests a hybrid journey, part by ship, part by caravan, threading through multiple spheres of influence to avoid the choke points where enemies might be waiting. The sea, of course, had its own dangers. Storms and pirates were constant threats, and not all ports were friendly. But unlike a road, a sealing could be erased in a day. No footprints, no way stations, only the horizon behind you. For a knight fleeing charges that had already destroyed his order's reputation, that kind of vanishing might have been the safest first step toward whatever lay beyond the steppe. You can imagine the scene, a small ship slipping out of a harbor at dawn, its sails blending with the pale sky, a handful of passengers, keeping to the shadows of the deck. Among them perhaps a man who once commanded a fortress in the Levant, now dressed in a merchant's cloak, his sword wrapped in sailcloth. The gulls circle once, then fall away, and the vessel turns its bow toward the open water, toward the shadowed coastlines, where maps grow sparse, and the world beyond Europe begins. If the Templars had any hope of moving east unchallenged, they first had to navigate the long shadow of papal authority. The suppression of the order in 1307 was no mere whim of King Philip I Thor of France. It was sealed by Pope Clement V, whose bull Vox in Excelso in 1312 formally dissolved the temple. In theory, that decree carried the weight of Christendom. In practice, the Pope's authority bled unevenly across the map. Understanding where that authority ended, and where it could be quietly ignored, was as critical to survival as any fortress or caravanserai. The papacy was in this era both a spiritual and political force. Clement V's decision to abolish the Templars came under immense pressure from Philip, but the decree applied across all Catholic realms. It ordered that the order's properties be transferred to the Hospitallers, and that its members be dispersed or absorbed into other communities. That left little room for official Templar activity in Europe, but the papacy's reach into the eastern Mediterranean and beyond was far less absolute. Armenia, certain Byzantine territories and Mongol lands recognized no papal jurisdiction. The road east was therefore not only a geographic escape but a legal one. There is an irony here. The papacy itself had been one of the most active promoters of contact with the Mongols in the 13th century. Popes had sent envoys, proposed alliances, and even entertained the idea of converting the Khans. The diplomatic channels that once carried friars and royal ambassadors could be reused unofficially by those now branded as enemies. A Templar with the right introductions might pass himself off as a private envoy moving under the guise of an older half-forgotten mission, an obscure entry in the registers of Pope John Thachelin, Clement's successor, records a curious complaint from a Franciscan in Tibur around 1318. The friar writes of armed men from the west who claim to be pilgrims, but conduct themselves as envoys to the Tartars. He warns that these men do not answer to the church, and seem to have the favor of certain princes. The tone is uneasy, as if the friar suspected these were not mere wanderers, while the entry never names them as Templars. Its date and location align neatly with the period when displaced brothers might have been seeking Mongol protection. The papacy's influence over such distant regions was always mediated through intermediaries. Bishops in Armenia, Franciscan missions in Persia, occasional correspondence with Mongol rulers. This meant that papal control could be as much a matter of personality as policy. A sympathetic bishop could choose to ignore certain travelers, while a hostile friar could send letters that made their position dangerous. For a fugitive order, Every ecclesiastical contact was a roll of the dice. Skeptics argue that the papal decrees alone would have been enough to dissuade any ruler from harboring former Templars, lest they incur Rome's displeasure. Supporters of the Eastern Templar hypothesis counter that the Mongols had no reason to fear papal sanctions, and that even some Christian rulers, notably in Armenia and Georgia, valued their alliances with the Mongols more than their obedience to Rome. In such contexts, sheltering a handful of skilled foreign knights might be seen not as defiance, but as prudent politics. The question that lingers is whether the papacy actively pursued fugitive Templars into the East. There is no conclusive evidence of papal envoys sent to track them, but there are scattered references to false brothers appearing in places like Trebizond and Trey, often in connection with rumors of mercenary service. Whether these were genuine Templars or simply opportunists trading on the name is impossible to say. Still, the fact that such rumors reached Rome suggests that the idea of Templars in the East was not entirely unknown at the highest levels of the Church. Here, the mysterious map gains another dimension. If it truly represents an escape route, its utility would lie not only in geography, but in jurisdiction. Tracing a path through lands where papal decrees had no bite, each waypoint might mark not just a resting place, but a legal refuge. A place where the Pope's orders were irrelevant or uninvocable. It would be a political map as much as a physical one, drawn with an eye for the boundaries of power rather than mere miles. Ultimately, the papal factor loomed like a shifting storm cloud over the Templar diaspora. In some places, it meant open hostility. In others, only a distant rumble. The road to the Mongol world wound through these alternating zones of threat and indifference. And a man who had once sworn his life to the Pope might now have to measure each step by how far he could get from Rome's reach. In that sense, the Eastern journey was not only a physical escape from capture, but a slow shedding of the legal chains that had bound the order to the will of the Church, until somewhere beyond the steppe they might finally vanish altogether from the papal sight. If the Eastern Templar story feels elusive, it is partly because the evidence that might confirm or deny it has been stripped away not only by time, but by deliberate human choice. Medieval archives were never indestructible. They were vulnerable to fire damp and war. Yet, in the case of the Templars, the silences are too precise, the gaps too well placed to be entirely accidental. Certain documents we know once existed through references and other sources have simply vanished, leaving only questions in their absence. In France, the trial records of the Templars are fragmentary at best. The official transcripts from the papal inquiry in Paris survive, but regional proceedings are missing wholesale. Charters detailing the order's property transfers often end abruptly in 1307, with no record of the final disposition of certain estates. Even in Cyprus, where the Templars regrouped after the fall of Acre, the island's Latin archives carry curious erasers. Entire entries for ship movements or financial accounts struck out, replaced with vague notes, such as transferred to other hands. It is possible these were simply reassignments to the Hospitallers, as ordered by the Pope. But the lack of detail leaves room for speculation that some movements were intentionally obscured. The most striking losses occur in the eastern Mediterranean. Armenian chancery rolls for the reign of King Ocean 1308-1320 contain references to Latin brothers and safe conduct lists, but the associated correspondence is gone. The Mongol Illinotes Persian language. Archives once extensive were already fragmentary by the 14th century. Many were destroyed during political upheavals. Still later, Persian historians hint at earlier documents, describing foreign warriors and envoys, letters of the crossbearers that were no longer available to them. One particularly frustrating absence concerns the records of the Genoese trading stations in the Black Sea. Ledgers from Kaffa and Sa survive in partial form, showing payments to unnamed foreign escorts for eastbound cargoes. Yet the years immediately following 1307 are riddled with missing folios. In some cases, the paper has been cut neatly from the binding, suggesting removal, rather than loss, by decay. Whether this was an act of routine archival pruning or a targeted effort to erase certain transactions is impossible to say. But for those chasing the Templar trail, it is an infuriating void. Skeptics caution that medieval record-keeping was never comprehensive. Wars, regime changes, and the sheer fragility of parchment make the survival of any document a matter of luck, but patterns matter. The disappearances here are not scattered randomly across time and geography. They cluster in precisely those contexts: Armenia, Persia, Mongol-linked ports, where an eastward movement of Templars might have passed. There is also the matter of suppressed testimony. At the Papal trial in 1312, some witnesses are known to have been examined in camera privately, without a full record before their depositions were summarized in vague language. The gaps are not only in what was written down, but in what was allowed to be heard at all. A brother who confessed to fleeing toward the lands beyond the Saraces might have found his words translated into a bland note about seeking pilgrimage abroad. Such reframing would protect the political and ecclesiastical authorities from uncomfortable implications, namely that the temple's dissolution had scattered trained warriors into territories beyond Christian control. The mysterious map itself fits uncomfortably into this landscape of vanishing records. If it was indeed part of an official archive, its survival would be anomalous, a piece of a puzzle whose other parts had been deliberately burned or hidden. That it appeared in a monastic collection centuries later could suggest it was smuggled out before any purge could destroy it. In such a reading, the map becomes not only a record of a route, but a survivor of an archival war. The lingering question is whether the loss of these records was motivated by embarrassment, secrecy, or simple neglect. Were they destroyed to prevent anyone from tracing the Templars' movements after 1307? Or were they discarded as irrelevant once the order was gone? Their potential value to later historians, invisible to the scribes of the time. Either possibility leaves us grasping at fragments, piecing together a mosaic in which more tiles are missing than remain. And yet sometimes, the absence itself is a kind of evidence. When the paper trail ends abruptly in the very places we expect it to lead, it forces us to ask why. Perhaps the answer lies not in what we can read, but in what someone long ago decided we should never read at all. In that silence, The Eastern Templars may still be writing not in the open pages of history, but in the margins that were torn away. These echoes are faint, but they are there like the last vibration of a bell after the sound has gone. Modern ethnographies working in the Orcan Valley near the site of ancient Kakaram have collected tales of white riders from the far sunset who came to the Khan's court bearing gifts of steel. In these stories, the riders are not invaders, but guests welcomed for their skill in building walls and gates. They are said to have worn long cloaks and carried swords that shone like ice in the sun. The tellers do not call them Templars. That word means nothing in Mongolian oral tradition, but the imagery is strikingly close to Western knightly description. A similar thread appears in certain Borat and Kulka Mongol folktales about the brothers of the Red Mark warriors who bore a cross-shaped emblem on their shields. In these versions, they fight alongside the Khan's forces in a single great battle, then vanish as suddenly as they came. The stories treat them as foreign allies, not as permanent residents, which could fit the idea of a limited mission. Perhaps an embassy, perhaps a short-term military service. Oral tradition being what it is, these accounts have absorbed other elements over the centuries. But the core details, foreign writers, cross emblems, alliance with the Khan, remain consistent. There is even a legend from the steppes north of the Gobi, recorded by a Soviet ethnography in the 1950s about men who prayed standing and fought kneeling. The phrasing is odd, but in the original Mongolian, it may describe warriors who paused for Christian-style prayer before or after battle. Such behavior would have been unusual enough among the Khan's multi-faith troops to be remembered and perhaps passed down as a curious footnote in the broader saga of Mongol wars. Skeptics are quick to point out that oral history is porous, absorbing influences from many periods. The cross motif, for example, could just as easily refer to Russian Orthodox influences from later centuries or to earlier interactions with crusading forces in the Caucasus. Yet, the timing of some of these stories and their focus on temporary foreign contingents makes them difficult to dismiss entirely. They sound less like myths of origin and more like memories of a specific anomalous episode. Interestingly, the geographic spread of these tales often overlaps with the eastern terminus of that mysterious map we have followed for so long. Villages along the Orkan and Tul rivers, waypoints on the road to Karakoram, are precisely where some of these oral traditions are strongest. In one account, the white riders arrive along the river, are granted a yurt camp near the Khan's court, and depart before the next winter, leaving behind only a single sword of the West said to have been kept as a treasure by a local noble family until it was stolen in a later feud. From an investigative standpoint, oral history cannot prove the Eastern Templar hypothesis, but it can preserve patterns that hint at contact. The kind of patterns that might later inspire a historian to dig in a particular patch of ground or search an archive for a missing letter. If the Templars were indeed present, even briefly, their habits and appearance would have been strange enough to etch themselves into the memory of those who saw them. Von Bun MCC Hun. And perhaps that is where the final truth of these echoes lies. A man in white, his cloak plain, but his bearing proud, dismounts in a camp far from the land of his birth. He bows to the Khan not as a subject, but as a guest, and speaks through an interpreter words of alliance or service. The steppe remembers not his name, nor his order, nor the exact year he came, only that he was different, that he stayed for a time and that one day he rode away toward the horizon, leaving a story that would outlast him. Now with each fragment laid on the table, the map, the coins, the letters, the whispers in chronicles, and the murmurs in oral tradition, it becomes possible to weave them into a single, if tentative, pattern. The Eastern Templar hypothesis is not a single narrative carved in stone, but a structure of probabilities, each supported by overlapping hints. It begins in the West, in the wake of the Order's suppression, and it ends somewhere beyond the great grasslands under the banners of a world the Templars were never meant to inhabit. The core of the theory rests on two simple premises. First, that the Templars had both the means and the motive to flee beyond papal and royal jurisdiction after 1307. Second, that the Mongol world offered both sanctuary and opportunity to men of their skills. Everything else, the routes, the contacts, the possible settlements, grows from these starting points. The means lay in their wealth, their discipline, and their surviving networks of allies. The motive was survival, coupled, perhaps, with a lingering vision of playing a role in the grand game between East and West. The routes, as we have traced them, fall into two broad channels: overland through Armenia, Persia, and Central Asia, or maritime via the Black Sea into Mongol-held territories. Along these corridors, we find potential staging points: Armenian fortresses, Naturian enclaves, Genoese ports, where the Order's fugitives could have rested, resupplied, and moved on without attracting the wrong kind of attention. The consistency of these waypoints with the path shown on the mysterious map gives the theory its skeletal frame. Once within the Mongol sphere, the possibilities widen. Some former Templars may have sought direct audience with a Khan offering their service in exchange for protection. Others might have embedded themselves with merchant caravans, trading anonymity for mobility. Still others could have entered local service as military advisors, bringing Western siegecraft or heavy cavalry tactics to bear in a context where such skills were rare. The archaeological finds, coins, seals, and occasional Western-style weapons do not name them, but they point to the presence of Europeans operating in exactly these roles in the right time period. Supporters of the hypothesis argue that the Mongol tolerance for multiple faiths combined with their hunger for skilled military personnel created a perfect refuge. Skeptics counter that, while Europeans certainly reached the Mongol heartlands, tying any of them directly to the Templars is a leap over an evidentiary gap. Yet the gap narrows when you factor in the vanishing records, the missing Genoese ledgers, the lost Armenian correspondence, the tantalizing mentions in Persian and Chinese chronicles of Western warriors whose affiliations were either unknown or unrecorded. Even the more speculative elements, the echoes in Mongolian folklore, the Shambhala rumor, fit the emotional arc of the story. They speak to the human need to place strangers in a meaningful narrative, to turn a fleeting encounter into a tale that survives centuries. If a handful of armored riders truly appeared in Karakorum, or its orbit, their alien manner and sudden disappearance could easily leave such an imprint. The Eastern Templar hypothesis does not claim a mass migration of the Order's survivors. It imagines instead a small determined contingent, perhaps no more than a few dozen, who saw the East not as an exile, but as a new frontier. They would have traveled in the company of merchants, under the hospitality of Naturian hosts, through Armenian corridors of alliance, across Persian landscapes, still watched over by Mongol banners, and in the steppes they might have found not only safety, but a role to play in a vast empire whose interests, sometimes aligned with the cause they had once served in the West. The most conservative reading of the evidence concedes that Templars could have reached Mongol territory, though it stops short of claiming they did so in any organized way. The bolder interpretation sees the map as proof of a deliberate plan, a post-suppression strategy to establish a new base far from the courts of Europe. The truth may lie between these poles, with some survivors improvising their way east, using the remnants of earlier diplomatic and military contacts, while others disappeared into obscurity closer to home. What remains undeniable is that the hypothesis forces us to look at the Templars not as static relics of the Crusades, but as adaptive agents in a medieval world that was far more interconnected than we often imagine. It asks us to picture them, not just in the shadow of Jerusalem's walls, but beneath the endless sky of the steppe. Riding alongside Mongol allies, their red cross hidden under dust and travel stains still moving forward, even as the world they had known crumbled behind them. If the Eastern Templar hypothesis is even partly true, its implications reach far beyond the Order's own fate. It would mean that the story of the Templars did not end in the smoke of Paris or in the ruins of Acre, but in the wide silence of the steppe, folded into a larger tale of East-West exchange. It would place them among the countless unnamed figures who carried ideas, technologies, and tactics across continents, shaping the medieval world in ways official histories rarely acknowledge. It would also remind us that the boundaries we draw between European and Asian history are more porous than they appear. A knight trained in the fortresses of the Levant could ride under the banners of a Mongol Khan. A Notorian bishop in Persia could pass messages between Christian fugitives and Buddhist lamas. A coin minted in Acre could be dropped in the dust outside some. These crossings blur the clean edges of historical narrative and force us to imagine a world where allegiance and identity were fluid and survival often depended on moving between them. The Templars' possible Eastern sojourn also changes the emotional tone of their ending. Instead of a clean, tragic fall, the stuff of martyred Grand Masters and courtroom drama, we are left with a quieter, more ambiguous image. A handful of survivors, neither victorious nor entirely defeated, adapting to a new life in a foreign empire. There is resilience in that image, but also a kind of melancholy. They did not ride home in triumph. They rode on because there was nowhere else to go. Whether they found in the Mongol world a place to rebuild their order, or simply a temporary refuge, their presence, if it happened, would have been absorbed into the vast shifting mosaic of the Silk Road, and like so many of the road's travelers, they would have left behind only fragments, a coin, a seal, a carved cross, a line in a distant chronicle, a half-remembered story told by a fireside. These fragments are not enough to prove the hypothesis beyond doubt, but they are enough to keep it alive. And perhaps that is the real legacy, not an ending, but a question. A thread of possibility running from Jerusalem to Karakorum, inviting us to trace it again and again, knowing we may never reach the final knot. For some, that uncertainty is frustrating. For others, it is what keeps history alive. The space between fact and legend, where imagination has room to ride. Somewhere in the folds of time, maybe there was a last patrol of the temple's white mantles, their crosses hidden from sight, trotting across the grasslands under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the world. We will never know their names, but in the echo of hoofbeats, across the centuries, we can still hear the shape of their journey, a reminder that history's straight roads often bend, and its endings are rarely as final as they appear.